to the Critical Hour here on Radio Sputnik. I'm Wilmer Leon, joined here by my co-host, Garland Nixon.
Thank you, Wilmer.
Orinoco Tribune reports Congo's army. Attempted coup in Kinshasa suppressed and situation under control. A quote-unquote attempted coup in Kinshasa, the capital of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, was suppressed on Sunday by defense and security forces, according to Sylvain Ekenge, a spokesperson for the Congolese army. For insight into this, let's turn to our next guest. He holds the John J. and Rebecca Moores Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He's one of the most prolific writers of our time. His latest books are entitled I Dare Say, a Gerald Horne Reader, and Acknowledging Radical Histories. And also, sir, there's a new book that's due out in just a couple of weeks, and the title of which is
Armed Struggle, Panthers and Communists, Black Nationalists and Liberals in Southern California through the 60s and 70s.
That's the voice of Dr. Gerald Horne. As always, sir, welcome back.
Thank you for inviting me.
So, quote, the Army reassures that the situation is under control and asks Kinshasa residents to freely go about their business, the spokesperson said in a brief message. What's going on in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Dr. Gerald Horne?
Well, let's consider the context, first of all. The DRC is larger than some iterations of Western Europe. It is a repository and a storehouse of natural resources, which we'll get to in a second. But I think what we should focus on in the first instance with regard to this attempted coup in Kinshasa is the admitted role of U.S. nationals, admitted even by the U.S. ambassador. This is a reflection of a number of tightly interlocked points, that is to say, contestation with the People's Republic of China, not least for these aforementioned resources, and as well, votes by sovereign African nations in multilateral bodies, such as the United Nations General Assembly, which just upgraded the status of Palestinian people, for example. You can apply a similar analysis to other forms of unrest that are erupting, for example, in the South Seas in New Caledonia, the French colony, where there is a substantial deposit of nickel, essential for the green economy. Also, as ever, fear of the role of the People's Republic of China in that neighborhood, not least in similarly endowed Papua New Guinea and, of course, the Solomon Islands as well. Now, back to the DRC, there is another wrinkle which we're going to have to think about very carefully. That is to say, a major investor, if not the chief investor in the DRC, is the Israeli billionaire Dan Gertler. He controls many of the mines that have access to these natural resources. But like Israel itself, Dan Gertler is not seen as being reliable on the bedrock issue of China. Recall, we've talked on this program many times about how Israel has been accused credibly of leaking sophisticated U.S. military technology to the People's Republic of China. As a result, you see that Washington is trying to work out a deal whereby sanctions against Gertler will be lifted, but then he'll have to sell his vast interests to a more politically reliable source, politically reliable when it comes to dealing with China. I dare say that this conflict with Gertler is of a piece with the ongoing conflict that you espy in your headlines concerning the United States and Israel, ostensibly and understandably and justifiably concerning Gaza and the reputational damage being done to U.S. imperialism as a result of Israel unwilling to come to an accord with Hamas. But you cannot ignore altogether this issue of Gertler and the sanctions deal that I was just making reference to, because the DRC is a repository, to cut to the chase, of coltan, essential for those mobile phones that are so ubiquitous nowadays, not to mention cobalt and other resources too numerous to mention. Its close neighbor, speaking of Zambia, is one of the major producers of copper, and copper is essential for electricity transmission, which is becoming all the more important as you see the shift from internal combustion engines running on petrol or gasoline to electric vehicles. Both the DRC, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, and Zambia are seen as, generally speaking, pro-U.S., but they're not necessarily perceived as being anti-China. And the United States prefers the latter, and that's one of the reasons, I suspect, why a Congolese American was seen as being at the tip of the spear with regard to this attempted coup against the Tshisekedi government, which by all accounts is a pro-U.S. government, but is not necessarily an anti-China government. Now, we also have to consider the historical context. I'm sure that there are those in your audience who recall how after Congo came to independence in the early 1960s, that their leader, Patrice Lumumba, was assassinated with the complicity of the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency. In fact, you don't have to accept my point. You can look at the memoir that the CIA station chief, Larry Devlin, that's Devlin, not Devil, wrote, admitting to his agency's complicity. Or you can go back before then to the time when Congo was the personal fiefdom of King Leopold in Brussels. That was at a time when the aforementioned internal combustion engine powering automobiles was taking off. DRC had rubber. Those workers who were oftentimes forced laborers, neo-slaves, who did not produce enough, oftentimes had their limbs hacked off. You look at photos, you'll see a number of Congolese without hands, without arms, without legs. And we also know before the takeover of Congo, before the 1880s, the Congo was a happy hunting ground for U.S. enslavers. In fact, one of the few slave traders who was executed, believe it or not, but admittedly this was after the United States was in a death match with the so-called Confederate States of America, and the United States was trying to cut off the supply of enslaved Africans to Dixie. Well, that man who was executed, Nathaniel Garten, had gone into the Congo to kidnap hundreds of Congolese and bring them back to the United States to work as enforced slave labor. This was not uncommon, which is why he was there circa 1860, 1861. And we also know that after King Leopold's inglorious rule and misrule took off, that Belgium, his nation, was a relatively minor power that was heavily dependent upon a burgeoning U.S. imperialism. And in fact, look at your notes and you will find that one Senator Morgan of Alabama was trying to concoct a deal to deport Alabama Negroes directly back to the Congo with the complicity of King Leopold. Now, of course, there is a wider, even wider context, which is, of course, the crisis of French imperialism reflected in what's happening in the Sahel, reflected in their being ousted from Niger, and then the United States being ousted from Niger in turn, not to mention what's happening in Mali and Burkina Faso. We also took careful notice of that article in the Washington Post a few days ago that talked about how the Nigerian leaders were totally upset and dissatisfied with the condescension and patronizing attitude taken by the U.S. officials who were trying to counsel them not to deal with China, not to sell their precious commodities, speaking of uranium, to Iran, but instead to continue sending it to France for a pittance. That has led to the impending shutting down of a U.S. drone base in Niger that cost U.S. taxpayers over $100 million. But at the same time, you see that the China National Petroleum Corporation has worked out a deal with the Nigerian authorities to pump another precious commodity, speaking of petroleum, through a 1,900-kilometer pipeline to Benin on the West African coast and being shipped to China. The Nigerian authorities were able to pocket $400 million for that deal, which, of course, will do wonders for the education and health care of the heretofore suffering Nigerian masses.
Military Times reports U.S. troops equipment will depart from Niger by mid-September. They were ordered out of Niger by the West African country's leadership, and apparently they're going to. It seems to be taking them quite a while to get out of the country, Dr. Horne.
Well, you should not count your chickens before the eggs are hatched.
Ooh.
Do not be surprised if the United States is able to pull a rabbit out of the hat and able to try to delay this evacuation indefinitely. Obviously, they're putting enormous pressure on the Nigerian authorities. Keep in mind as well that there are still French agents crawling all over the place in Niamey. We know that there are still French puppet regimes in the neighborhood, speaking of Côte d'Ivoire in the first instance. And we also know that despite the change of regime in Gabon, that you have a military regime there that is not necessarily unfriendly to the French authorities, nor to the U.S. authorities as well. So this is a very perilous and fraught moment. On the one hand, you see that many West African nations have had it up to their keister dealing with U.S. imperialism and French neocolonialism, and they would like to work out mutually beneficial and profitable deals with China, with Russia. But at the same time, there is a certain weakness that they have to consider, which is that there are still French agents, U.S. agents in the territory. There is still enormous leverage that the United States can exact with regard to various multilateral agencies. So let's just stay tuned. And
I'll ask this of you, as we've asked it of a couple of our other guests. When you look at the recent coup in Congo and in Niger and what's happening in New Caledonia, is it hyperbole? Is it a stretch to connect this to Gaza? In that, I would say that as goes the settler colony project in Gaza, so goes settler colonialism.
Well, there is something to what you say, but there's also the related point aforementioned, which is that U.S. imperialism and their North Atlantic allies are suffering enormous reputational damage because of their backing for Israel, and that is causing their position in Africa, in Latin America, in Asia, in the South Seas to be compromised, thereby jeopardizing the natural resources which heretofore they've been able to obtain for so long. So this is going to put quite a bit of pressure on the Israeli authorities. You already see the indictment in the International Criminal Court of Mr. Netanyahu and Mr. Gallant, his top military man. That, too, is going to put pressure on the Israeli authorities. And so this plot has yet to be worked out altogether, but signs are pointing inevitably and indelibly to a deep and profound crisis of world imperialism.
Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, sir, thank you so much for your time. Greatly appreciate that analysis. We look forward to having you back.
Thank you.